Going.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight is July 13, 2024, and you are attending the GLREA 2024 Solar Story Renewable Energy Seminar. Tonight we'll be having a presentation on alternatives for electric supply and distribution to investor-owned utilities. I'm your host, Mark Clevey. I'm a lifetime member of GLREA, a former vice president and secretary of GLREA. Tonight, Mike Shriberg, PhD, University of Michigan professor of practice and engagement, director of engagement, Cooperative Institute for Great Lakes Research and Michigan Sea Grant, and his graduate students will be giving us a presentation. Our financial sponsors tonight are Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. Again, I'm your host, Mark Clevey, and I'm one of the founders of the Solar Story Renewable Energy Seminar Series, along with John Sarver. Formed in 1991, the Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association is a 501c3 nonprofit organization supported by members to educate and advocate for renewable energy in Michigan. You can learn more about GLREA membership opportunities at our website, www.glrea.org. Our GLREA Solar Stories, again, were founded by our esteemed John Sarver. The first Thursday of each month is Ann Arbor Solar Stories. Second Thursday is myself, the Renewable Energy Seminar. Third Thursday is a Detroit Solar Stories, and our fourth is a statewide on questions, answers, interesting stories, and other interesting things on solar. Our Renewable Energy Story Seminar covers topics of interest to renewable energy users, businesses, advocates, and stakeholders. Seminars include content ranging from technology to business to public policy. It's a Zoom event, and again, it's held on the second Thursday of the month from 7 to 8. And I'm your host, and you have my email in front of you. We ask that you remember to mute yourself. It's always unfortunate to have somebody's dog talking in the background. Please also hold all questions until the end of the presentation. You can raise your hand under reactions to ask a question, and I'll call on you. What we're talking about tonight is, again, alternatives to electricity supply and distribution to investor-owned utilities. We kind of know about this. This cartoon goes way back into the 1980s. You know, they own the mines, the gas, the wells, the energy, uranium. They want solar power. Well, solar isn't feasible. We're still hearing that today. It's only feasible if the utilities own it. Is the latest mantra, which means it ain't feasible at all as long as their hand is into it, because they are investor-owned utilities. And the word investor-owned is important because that means everybody else in Michigan is the product. So tonight I want to welcome Dr. Mike Shriberg, who's University of Michigan again. I'll hold his title this time. He'll be joined tonight by several of his graduate students from the multiple programs at the University of Michigan. Their study assessed 4 alternatives for electrical supply and distribution to investor-owned utilities in Michigan. Each of the 4 options was assessed against climate, reliability, and justice criteria. The results weighted on long-term pros and cons without assessing the politics of a statewide public takeover of existing investor-owned utilities, the utilization of sustainable energy utilities, and assistance for increased municipalization and increasing the power authority of the Michigan Public Service Commission. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn this over to Mike, and I'll come back at the end for questions. Mike, it's yours.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Let me just share my screen here and make sure we got it up and running. Give me a thumbs up. Is that looking good? Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. As Mark said, my name is Mike Shriberg, faculty member here at the University of Michigan, and I'm here with 3 of my grad students who will be doing parts of this presentation and will be introducing themselves as we go here. And I want to start by giving you kind of a roadmap to, I guess, this roadmap project, right? I'm going to do a bit of an introduction to the project and sort of the frameworks on this and who some of the partners. Where did this come from, and how did we get going on it? Then there's 4 different options, as Mark laid out. I'm going to cover the first, and then I've got one of the students each is going to cover the next 3 up. three options on there. So looking at how do we reform the MPSC, kind of the least radical of these options. What about creating a statewide public power authority or a statewide public authority? What about the rise in munis? And then looking at sustainable energy utilities. And then we'll come back and kind of compare these against each other. Now, this is a preview to a report that is just being finalized now and which will be public. A substantial document. It's got, I don't know, it's a few hundred pages, footnotes, and all those kinds of things. So we're kind of putting that together. I gave Mark like a little preview of this. He thought it'd be good for this audience, but this will all be made public online in July. So you're kind of getting the early story of this. So, oops, there we go. So how did this start, right? Like in this, oh, and I want to give credit to my co-instructor on this, someone that many of you probably know, Andy Bucksbaum. He's a faculty member in the law school and my longtime colleague at the National Wildlife Federation prior to that. But, you know, this came about because some conversations that both Andy and myself, both coming from the nonprofit advocacy community, were having with a series of climate and environmental justice leaders. And, you know, as Mark just outlined, the basic premise, and you know, this isn't a group I have to convince of this, is that our investor-owned utilities are failing us, right? I mean, they're failing along many of the criteria that we care about. And you can see that driving question here: climate, reliability, equity, it should say actually energy justice and affordability, right? Along those criteria, our utilities are failing us in part because the incentive system is wrong, right? In part because the incentive system is wrong. And we've got, our state, of course, has strong standards on this now, but we're still struggling with poor incentives and we're chipping around the margins. And again, you know, the report goes into this in more detail. This isn't a crew that probably needs that background, but just to know where this came from. And so we were approached by multiple people in the NGO community saying, can we do an assessment of what an alternative to IOUs would look like? Nobody has put together, and not just in Michigan, but in any state, a comparison amongst the different options. And what would our system look like either in the absence of or with a significantly changed relationship to investor-owned utilities? So those were our two driving questions on this. And so, oh no, I'll get to that. So then we looked at, okay, what are the metrics behind this? How do we actually put this together? Well, one, we started looking at climate, we looked at energy justice, and we looked at reliability and affordability, largely using the criteria and the goals that the state has set out, but actually, you know, having problems meeting in different ways, right? We know we had some big advances on the energy policy side, but they're still kind of chipping around the margins when you look at the big questions that are driving forward on this. Now, I'll say that Michigan has this vehicle to look at this. That I'm going to go back for a minute. I meant to cover this here. Michigan has this vehicle to look at this, the University of Michigan. So the problem solving initiative is an initiative of the law school that brings together graduate students from all across campus to tackle one problem over the course of a term. And so the clients for this, for the Michigan Climate Action Network and the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, they're the ones that kind of came to us with these questions. We're really working for them, but we brought in expertise from across the state and across campus. In fact, I'm sure there are people on this Zoom that were brought in as experts at one point or another. But we had this amazing crew of students. We had, you know, there were law students there, of course. There were students from my home unit, which is School for Environment and Sustainability, business students, engineering, physics, public health, social work, School of Information. I'm missing some, but you get the sense. All kind of putting our heads together on this and looking at these options. So, without further ado, I want to walk you through what, how we went about each of those, and then minimize myself here because I'm running over slides. And I'm going to walk through the first one because these students, you know, I should say they're grad students. Most of them graduated. So many of them are off doing other things, but 3 of them were kind enough to come back for this, but not one on this team that could make it. But we started by looking at what would it look like to significantly reform the MPSC. And I'm going to do this one pretty quickly because, again, I think it's an alternative that you all are probably pretty familiar with. But we looked at what are the best options out there amongst leading states in this. And the thing about this option is it's been put into place by different states. Hawaii is a leader in this. Connecticut is a leader in this. There's some elements, and this surprised me, and it gives me a little pain as a Michigan person, but Ohio actually has some strong leadership on elements of this as well. I actually grew up in Ohio, so it's not that painful for me. But that's the that's part of what we were looking at, and it's on these four prongs. And how do we sort of combine these and put them together? And that is performance-based rate making, having a plan that's a percentage of income payment plan, so a PIP, doing an innovation fund and innovation promotion, and establishing a true Office of Consumer Advocates, true consumer advocacy within the agency. The basic problem here, as we defined it, is that the MPSC is not able to keep up with the pace and scale of reform that's happening in the industry, nor the pace and scale that's needed on climate grounds, on reliability grounds, and on equity grounds as well. And that's in part because of the regulatory structure, and it's in part because of a lack of aggressiveness in implementing the structure. So if we start with the performance-based regulatory mechanisms, this chart here, and I'm not going to go through the details of it. Again, we're summarizing pretty quickly a long report here. But the bottom line is, if you actually do PBRs, performance-based regulations, and you have a formula, that formula you see in the lower right is in place in Hawaii, and it's linking revenue performance to incentives through the PIMs, the performance incentive mechanisms. And well, you all are in the energy industry. I guess I don't have to apologize for all the acronyms, but there's so many of them when you go in this detail on it. But looking at things like actually scaling it for reliability and resilience, giving incentives and disincentives for accelerating the RPS standards or the RES standards that you have in place, affordability, customer service, et cetera. We know right now the incentive structure is a major barrier, if not the major barrier, to utility performance on this. Now, if you then combine that with the percentage of income payment plan, right? So this is on the energy justice side, and we see this sometimes in water infrastructure and others. But essentially, you align the payments ability to pay, and you create a low income energy assistance. The financing mechanism is the standard one on a surcharge. And again, we have some elements of this, but not a percentage of income payment like some other states with more progressive policies on all this. The third leg of this four-part platform is promoting innovation. I mean, one of the things that's happening is it's hard to get innovation through the MPSC. As many, I see some folks on this call have long experience inside and outside the MPSC. And that's in part due to some of the structural barriers there. You have to be able to fast track some new policies. And Connecticut's been a real leader in this, in looking at what they're calling a regulatory sandbox, allowing new policies to be implemented quickly, easily, and tested, and then put into place long-term if they work. Right now, we kind of have the opposite system. You actually have to prove things are going to work over a multi-year process before we can even experiment with them significantly. And that pace of change has been something that's frustrated, certainly renewable energy development. And then finally, on this one, the Office of Consumer Advocacy. So this is actually having a customer service facing one and a policy facing one. This is actually, so right now, a lot of the interventions, and I was involved years ago when I was at the PIRGM, the Public Interest Research Group in Michigan, was doing a lot of intervention work. And it's very indirect and it's very difficult. The barriers to access are really high. Leading states actually have an office of advocacy that's consumer advocacy that's nested right within the MPSC. Now, what we did after outlining these ideas, we looked at, okay, what would it take to actually implement these? Well, some of them can be done within current regulatory authority, arguably, right? So the innovation promotion framework is within current authority. Now, MPSC operates, as folks probably generally know, under the reasonable and prudent standard. Well, actually, other states like Minnesota are looking at saying, actually, within that reasonable and prudent standard, you can actually do some of the performance-based rate making. That hasn't been tested and tried here, but there's an argument, and I think a strong argument. Again, the lawyers looked at this really carefully in this to made that standard can be expanded and used right now for a PBR, for the performance-based rate making. And then you need an executive order for the Office of Consumer Advocate, and you need legislative action for the performance incentives and other pieces. Actually, the Office of Consumer Advocate could be done through executive or legislative. So for each of these, and this is the last on this one, I'm going to turn it over to the amazing students who've been working on this. But each of these, we outline them against this set of criteria: the climate, reliability, affordability, and energy justice. And in the end, we'll kind of put these all up against each other. We had some more, we really wrestled with, because we have some more quantitative measures for all of these, but it's pretty hard to compare apples to apples. So we kind of went with this like green, yellow, red system as a proxy for that. In the report, there's far more detail under each of these. But for the MPSC really stands out on reliability and affordability, right? If you have those mechanisms in place, those four interlinked things, you clearly get to stronger reliability and affordability. It's likely you'd be better on climate and justice, or at least you have a chance of doing that. But there are some reasons to believe it could be harder on that too. So again, on balance, MPSC reform is something that's scalable pretty quickly. Some things can be done right now. Some would take legislative authority, some executive. Fairly low risk because it's based on existing programs, and it's particularly good at affordability and accessibility, but not nearly as transformative as some of the other pieces. So with that, I want to hand it over to Pratna, who's going to talk about the publicly owned power, as she was part of this team. So Pratna? And with the School of Information,
meet everyone.
Some of the diversity of students in there. So go ahead, please.
It's very lovely to meet everyone over here. And as Mike already summarized, I'm an information professional, and I'm happy to note that I'm planning to pursue a career in the clean energy domain, specifically as a technology professional. I'll be representing and doing my best effort to speak on behalf of the entire team, touching on different points. Can we go to the next one? So I'll be talking about a statewide publicly owned power model, which, as the name alludes, is a scaled effort for the public to own the power system. When we looked at this, we realized that we're proposing an option to acquire the distribution assets of investor-owned utilities. And we'll talk about that in a sec, why we're talking about only distribution assets. But it's important to know that this model or this alternative actually focuses on distribution assets only. And then a governance board that comprises of elected representatives from across the state and experts on the governance body. The premise behind this whole model or this alternative that we are suggesting is that the availability of shareholder profit funds, which are essentially locked away with shareholders right now, become available to invest and reinvest in renewable energy. And we looked at different factors of where these shareholder profits could be invested in, but that's essentially the premise behind this. We looked at all of the different investor-owned utilities in Michigan, and we understood the number of consumers that they're serving. It's really important to note that two of these stuck out because of their massive scale. And for the sake of comparison and drawing results, we only focused on these two utilities or acquisition of these two utilities, because the process for acquisition for the rest of the utilities would more or less be the same with much scaled down efforts. These would be our two biggest targets for acquisition. So remember I spoke, we were talking about only acquiring distribution assets. The reason that we are talking about this is that when we looked at the generation assets of these utilities, we noticed that the renewables are a very small context and most of them are fossil fuel assets. So when we're talking about a cleaner transition, it makes little sense to acquire fossil fuel assets, which are not clean generation efforts. And it's also important to know that transmission essentially is not owned by the investor-owned utilities in Michigan. So the legal context is that these assets can be acquired through eminent domain with just compensation for the assets, which is determined by the fair market value, but also can be determined by going concern, which essentially is the total value for the generation assets presented in the books minus the depreciation. So this going concern or total value, it depends on a lot of factors, such as what is the usage going to be for the acquired assets? Who is the audience going to be? What is the expertise like? And what are the future opportunities? And there are quite a few arguments that could go back and forth in this, but this is a way in which the investor-owned utilities can be acquired. Pardon my low knowledge on this because I'm not a legal professional, but I've done my best effort to highlight what the legal pathways could be. Essentially, it could go through something called as a quick take, which will allow to bypass the traditional litigation timeline, in which the assets are transferred over to an agency that comes into place during the asset takeover, and the agency can continue to operate them instead of the litigation being running because the compensation value cannot be determined. We'll look at what compensation value looks like in a sec, but essentially there are going to be a lot of projections on what the compensation value could be on the basis of what is the loss of business that takes place for IOUs and multiple other factors that we discussed before. The final transfer can be initiated by a ballot and via legislature by passing laws. So we're talking about the unique features of an SPO, and I'll be discussing finances for a little bit here. What we're looking at is that the IOUs profits that become available for reinvestment, either into cleaner resources or to lower the rates for the ratepayers in Michigan, for the residents of Michigan, total up to about 1.6 billion. And that's a huge number. While there are a few caveats that we discuss in the report, we're looking at 1.6 as a baseline number just for comparison. So this is a number that we're looking at to be reinvested, and we'll be talking about how this helps meet some of the criteria of climate change, of reliability, affordability, and energy justice. So the features that we are suggesting is that one, stakeholder profits become available. Two, a governance structure which is strong enough to align with the priorities of clean and equitable energy. And the final accountability that goes to ratepayers in Michigan instead of to the shareholders, which the IOUs currently are answerable to. So when there is going to be an acquisition of the distribution assets, the acquisition value or the valuation of those assets is determined by a range of multipliers. In the case of Pine Tree Power, which was a very similar effort which took place in Maine to take over their investor-owned utilities, this number came to about 1.5 times the valuation of those assets, depending on how much losses the utilities were suffering because their assets were being taken over and other multiple factors. This is an ambiguous number, which is often determined during litigation, and there's back and forth and settlements that take place in this, but it can range anywhere between the original price of original valuation of the distribution assets to about 3 times of what that valuation comes down to. And when we look at DT and Consumer Energy's combined assets, their valuation comes to roughly around 18.6 billion, but it is, when we look at it as a 3 times multiplier, it goes to a whopping 55.9, about $56 billion, which is a huge number. So determining the exact valuation is going to be a bit of a challenge, but this is just to highlight what it could look like during the acquisition. The governance structure has 3 major roles, and there are recommendations that we make in the governance structure to meet all of these 3 roles. First one is to involve the citizens in the participation of the decision-making processes. So locally elected representatives and a diverse group of energy experts is the best way to go about this. Additionally, relieving the MPSC of some of the distribution-related policymaking is also a way to go about this, and involving more citizens through something called as the Office of the Consumer Advocate, which is essentially a mechanism to evaluate and react to consumer needs, to understand what is it that the ratepayers need instead of constantly worrying about shareholder profits. And finally, but the most importantly, meeting the key climate reliability, justice, and affordability goals, in which we propose creating a governance charter for the newly established body, which has objectives and metrics to ensure that the accountability towards ratepayers is present, and there are metrics across all of these 4 areas for the statewide publicly owned power body to fulfill against. I will talk about how this alternative fares against these 4 criteria. Beginning with climate, it's important to know that the absence of IOU control in the investor-owned utility control in how solar and distributed assets participate in the grid is essentially nullified, and that creates a whole new horizon for distributed energy generation. And like we talked about earlier, shareholder profits now open up newer avenues for either increasing the renewable generation portfolio, increasing storage opportunities, which is a huge part of the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan, um, incentivizing more community participation through innovative programs and rate designs, leading by examples, converting more of state buildings and operational things into renewable powered buildings, and modernizing the grid for smarter operation. This one's important because if there's more money put into modernization, it also has cascading effects on affordability and reliability of power. So the experts that will be elected on the board will also ensure that the priority and emphasis on climate remains, and which is why this has a fair good amount of weight into a statewide publicly owned power model. When we talk about reliability and energy justice, Michigan has suffered a lot of failures, and there's been utility redlining where certain areas have disproportionate burdens of electricity as compared to others. But with the new profits being available, the funds being available from shareholder profits, it is possible to run a large-scale grid hardening effort, which will essentially result, like we talked about, in cascading effects in affordability, reliability, and also potentially having an open scope for accommodating more renewable generation and distributed energy resources. So this also presents unique financing opportunities because it operates in the public domain, and there are likely to be more opportunities that can be tapped into through this. And to summarize, all the four aspects of energy justice are possible to be addressed through the statewide publicly owned power model by different programs and models. When we're talking about affordability, this one was an interesting thing that we juggled with for quite a bit to understand what affordability would look like with a statewide publicly owned power model. There are two options in addressing how the funds available from shareholder profits could be used. The first one is to reinvest these profits, like we talked about, either in grid hardening or clean power generation. This would likely mean that the rates would increase for a little bit, but during a long-term period, they would go down and remain flat. The other option is to immediately cut down the rates and offer electricity at a cheaper rate to Michiganders, which is essentially to introduce innovative rate design and tariff programs, which would immediately decrease and has the potential to result in about 15% rate decrease. But this would sort of overlook the climate and reliability efforts. So this is a bit of a trade-off and juggle that we looked at, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail towards the end. So here are the couple of takeaways that we have. What is important to note is that prioritization of climate reliability, equity, and affordability is going to be of paramount importance from the governance board and the elected representatives that could be on the board. So it is important that individuals who would be elected need to prioritize all of these four factors in order to push them forward in Michigan. Quick take is an interesting discovery that we made in law where the transfer of ownership happens almost immediately, and there isn't a dragged litigation period where investor-owned utilities are operating assets that may not belong to them in the near future, which creates more disparity in electricity reliability. Imagine me operating something that I may not own in the near future. And it's important to note that the political landscape does introduce quite a bit of variability in this model, which makes things a little bit more complex, a little bit more difficult to actually implement. So there's quite a bit amount of risk associated with it, which unfortunately turned out against this model in Maine. So that's an example that we learned a lot from, and also the report includes ways to avoid some of the things that took place in Maine. In summary, it looks like energy equity and reliability of the grid is very likely to be increased when a statewide power model would be implemented. But climate and affordability are only fair because there is a trade-off in both of them. Either climate goals would be fulfilled with shareholder profits or affordability could be put into place. So these are both rated as fair.
Okay, thank you, Pratna. Let me introduce Zoe Salome, who is going to talk about municipalization efforts, a student in the Ford School for Public Policy.
Hi,
Yeah.
everyone. My name is Zoe Salami. I'm a newly graduated student from the University of Michigan Ford School of Public Policy, and I was on the municipalization team where we assessed the potential viability and impact of individual and widespread electrical utility municipalization in Michigan. And I look forward to going over that with you today. Mike, could we go to the next slide? Thank you. As many of you likely know, municipal electric utilities are defined as electrical utilities, either distribution or generation, that are owned and operated by municipalities. Currently, there are 40 municipal utilities in Michigan today, most of which were created in the 19th century. The most recent electrical utility created in Michigan was Traverse City Light and Power, which was founded in 1912. So it's been a while. In our assessment, we explored both the possibilities of individual municipalities creating such utilities, as well as the potential statewide impacts if many municipalities in Michigan pursued this path. Next slide. Slide after. Thank you. So there are currently a number of legal limitations that complicate this that I'll review quickly before diving into the content. So right now, Michigan is only one of 6 states that grants municipalities the ability to form municipal utilities within the state constitution. So in that way, it's very legally viable. Newly formed municipal utilities in Michigan can either acquire utility infrastructure from the incumbent investor-owned utility through purchasing it or condemning it to replace the utility, or developing entirely new infrastructure to compete with the incumbent utility for customers within the municipality's limits. There are several legal tensions and limitations that impact the ability of municipal utilities to operate and to form in Michigan that have kind of led to this slow down of munis in the 20th century. The first are the Foot Act franchises. In other states, municipalities can terminate franchise agreements with existing IOUs. However, the Foot Act established permanent franchise agreements with existing utilities in Michigan. This essentially means that municipalities cannot establish their own utilities without buying out the entirety of the existing utilities infrastructure within their limits or building a completely separate system. It makes it much harder and more expensive for them to do so. The next, which was discussed by my colleague prior, is quick take and then therefore risky litigation. In Michigan, municipalities can use quick take condemnation to expedite their municipalization, which allows them to obtain titles to utility properties without the delays of typical civil litigation if they demonstrate public necessity. However, this approach is really risky due to potential significant litigation with the utility companies happening after they acquire that property. The next kind of challenging piece is determining just compensation, which is determining the price of utility infrastructure. The utility essentially sets their own price for infrastructure in litigation, and they're often able to price out municipalities using such tactics. These challenges need to be addressed by any municipality looking to form their own utility or changed through statewide policy to ensure easier access to municipalization. Next slide. Next, I'm going to go over the technical feasibility of municipalization. So municipalization has happened before and will happen again. It is technically feasible, but challenges remain in making sure that those municipalities improve service through their municipal utilities. Some of these challenges include outdated distribution equipment that needs to be upgraded after acquisition. We have outdated infrastructure in a lot of places in Michigan. The need to build new distribution substations to serve their service territory. And then therefore the need to use eminent domain to acquire land for substations or other infrastructure within the bounds of the municipality, which can be challenging if land is limited. And then also the need to hire a contractor potentially to manage day-to-day operations of the utility, which can be slightly costly. All of these factors together can significantly impact the ability of a municipal utility to improve service for residents and are all considerations in whether they're able to do so. On the next slide, I'm going to discuss a little bit the financial feasibility of municipalization. To do so, we had a couple of different strategies that are described here and then also in more detail in our paper. To assess the financial viability of municipalization, we use the pictured factors here and estimated calculations at both this county and city levels for different municipalities in the state. I'll skip over this because it's a little complicated, but I'll go over the big pictures on the next slides. So here's the county level, and then Mike, could we go to the next one? The city level, which is the most relevant. So we found using these estimates that for the largest cities in Michigan, excluding Detroit, because there are different factors there, the cost of acquiring their share of an IOU's distribution assets will likely range from $250 million to $1.2 billion or more for each municipality. There's a very large range. These estimates are so highly variable because they depend really heavily on the acquisition multiple that's presented by the utility companies. So here in this table, you see the different calculations with different acquisition multiples. They tend to be between 1.5 and 3 that utilities may assign to the cost of their infrastructure. And therefore substantially affects the cost of acquisition. This tends to be costly for municipalities, which is why the barriers to entry are high. But these costs are spread out over a long time, and municipalities are able to make the choice if they're able to balance the books and ensure that they prepare for this variable range. Mike, could we go to the next slide? Regarding the cost of electricity for customers, we do assess with moderate confidence, even regardless of these acquisition multiples, that municipal utilities would likely charge customers lower electricity bills. There's a number of supporting evidence for this. There is Michigan Public Service Commission data that shows that DTE and consumer energy serve or have higher residential electricity bills than any investor-owned utility besides Upper Peninsula Power, and that on average, our municipal utilities charge lower rates. There's also additional analysis from the American Public Power Association that found that as of 2023, Michigan's municipal utilities have these lower bills than other states' IOUs. So that would be likely to continue should there be additional municipal utilities established in the state. On the next slide, I'll discuss a little bit about governance. Our paper included a section on governance and management that analyzed and recommended best practices for the creation and management of municipal utilities. We found that by their structure, these municipal utilities are largely driven by the city council and its constituents as are their priorities. The government set the utility priorities typically through a city charter structure, which makes the utilities structure and any priorities they'd like to enshrine there legally binding. We have a pretty detailed section about this in our paper, but some best practices are here. They include creating mechanisms for robust public participation and feedback for those utilities, creating mechanisms for fair rate setting and authorizing the establishment of preferential rates, programs supporting equity and energy justice goals, and funding to support equitable rate making. And then also potentially creating mechanisms to limit or stop power shutoffs for non-payment. Our paper also assessed the pros and cons of different management structures and provided guidance for municipalities considering this change. So on the next slide, to review our criteria assessment, we assessed the key criteria against 2 potential scenarios because we were thinking through those scenarios as we were writing the paper. The first being an individual municipality forming a utility and choosing to impact their residents positively doing so. And the second being the potential statewide impact of widespread municipalization. So for our climate indicator, there is a slight likelihood that greenhouse gas emission reduction efforts would improve under a single municipal utility through typically new renewable energy generation or power purchase agreements. Incentives do exist within municipalities to reduce their own emissions and to pursue energy efficiency, DER investments, and other overall energy usage reduction. However, individual municipalities may face challenges due to tensions with other goals, such as reliability or affordability. Given the variety of different municipalities in the state and the potential variety of their goals, the statewide impact of widespread municipalization on climate is really highly variable. On the next slide, I'll discuss our reliability indicator. Luckily, both in the individual and statewide scale, municipalization is likely to improve reliability. Data indicates that municipal utilities typically have better reliability than IOUs because they serve smaller service areas and are more publicly accountable to customers and city council than their own voters. On the next slide, we assessed how equity impacts on how equity could potentially impact how a municipal utility could support its constituents. Thanks, Mike. Individual municipalities have many opportunities to implement community supports, and being accountable to their residents through their city council structure, they're very likely to do so. So for an individual municipality, the likelihood is strong that equity will improve among its residents. Unfortunately, in the widespread municipalization scenario, this could lead to really highly varied outcomes, some of which due to different priorities among municipalities, and some of which due to cost. Likely, if many different municipalities chose to create their own utilities in, for example, a county, this would result in really varied access to clean energy, really varied access to affordability policies, and likely result in higher prices for municipalities that remain with their IOUs. On the next slide, kind of the other side of the same leaf, we discussed affordability. And like I mentioned before, municipal electric utilities are likely to improve affordability outcomes as they generally have lower rates than IOUs. However, the initial infrastructure investments discussed earlier may increase rates in the short term, with long-term outcomes resulting in lower rates. There are also significant equity concerns that arise if the most resourced communities municipalize first, which can leave low-income communities with higher IOU rates and poor infrastructure, kind of a death cycle for the IOU, leaving those residents who aren't able to be in the municipalized communities in a really tough place. So this is our overall assessment in the table. We discuss it in more depth in the table, but on the next slide, we kind of have our concluding points, where municipalizing utilities in Michigan does offer many potential benefits, including improved reliability, enhanced equity, and lower long-term costs. But it also entails considerable challenges. Legal obstacles, financial hurdles, and technical difficulties must be carefully navigated when a municipality is choosing to assess this or make this choice. The assessment in our paper suggests that individual municipalities could see substantial improvements, but that a widespread shift across the state could lead to really varied outcomes depending on the resources and priorities of each community. And moving forward, it's really crucial for municipalities to weigh these factors thoughtfully and engage in really robust public participation to ensure that any transition to a municipal utility aligns with their specific needs and goals. So thank you for your time. I look forward to answering your questions later.
Thank you, Zoe. And last but not least, to talk about sustainable energy utilities, Anita, and you know what? I've never said your last name out loud, so I'm not gonna try it now. But Anita, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. I'm Anita, like Zoe. I'm also a public policy graduate. Thank you for still being here, and thank you for having us. So yeah, the Sustainable Energy Utility, or SEU. So what's an SEU? The beauty of the SEU model is that it is incredibly flexible. It can be anything a community needs. And although the SEU model is variable, two goals remain true across all SEUs. One, increasing renewable energy generation, and two, making energy consumption more efficient. Unlike other paths, it requires no legislative change, no legal procedures or acquisitions of expensive IOU assets. It exists in parallel with IOUs existing in the state. Our model is speedy, less costly compared to other pathways, and has good potential for scalability. The way that we envision the Michigan SEU model to look like is for it to be municipally owned. The SEU model has a nimble nature that is best suited for localities, and the municipal ownership structure bypasses a lot of the state's legal requirements for energy distribution. We recommend that Michigan SEUs provide distributed solar installation and energy efficiency upgrade services. Based on a conservative estimation, we think that the initial goal for SEUs reach should be 10% of Michigan households. So now that you know what an SEU is, let's talk a little bit about how do we pay for it and how much it's going to cost. We estimate that solar generation for 650 households will annually. But the total cost of providing solar panels to 10% of households across Michigan is $836 million annually. We base our estimations on cost projections provided to us by SunStore Energy and 5 Lakes Energy for their Ann Arbor SEU cost projections. Our SEU model will recover service costs through a starting rate of 12.5 cents per kilowatt hour, which will annually increase to 24 cents by 2050. Comparatively, DTE charges much higher rates per kilowatt hour, making the SEU a more affordable electricity option. Energy efficiency upgrades costs and sorry, let me try that one more time. Energy efficiency upgrade costs will vary from community to community and household to household, but on average, efficiency upgrades cost about $5,000 according to the Department of Energy. Communities can use grant funding to provide such upgrades at no additional cost or at a discount to their residents. But overall, our model assumes 100% low-interest debt financing repaid through this ratepayer system that I mentioned. We unfortunately, unlike other SEUs in Delaware and in DC, we don't have financing structures that they have. So that is why we've relied on the 100% debt financing. Moving on to climate considerations. The SEU model has the potential to increase renewable energy generation and cover a significant portion of energy demand across communities, regardless of income level. While the per ton reduction cost of greenhouse gases depends on the scale of distributed solar, utility scale solar tends to be cheaper, as we know. The SEU model can lower electricity consumption by making energy consumption more efficient through these upgrades that we've mentioned. However, some energy efficiency upgrades might actually lead to increases in energy consumption, so that outcome is varied. But overall, any solar or efficiency programs will exist alongside already available IU or personal programs. And because this model is municipally owned and operates in an opt-in manner, communities and residents will need to be educated on the add value of the SEU and its services. Also, our current model is complementary to the IOU services. If an SEU wanted to expand their reach and consequently their climate impact, they would need to become load-bearing, and which the current model does not support. Now, in terms of reliability, this is a behind-the-meter structure, right? We are providing people solar panels and we're providing them energy efficiency services. And this model, the behind-the-meter structure of the SEU model for distributed solar allows residents to maintain access to electricity during outages when solar panels are producing electricity, right? So when everybody else connected to DTE loses power, those with solar panels have electricity, but that is during the day. For those that don't have battery storage and it happens at night, they too lose electricity. Storage enables protection from outages, regardless of whether solar panels are producing electricity or not. But storage increases the community cost for distributed generation. That is not currently part of our cost estimations. What we provide so far, cost estimations, just include solar panels. The community scale of the SEU model would allow a community to more swiftly address outages or technical challenges, though. Our last criteria, energy justice. Now, our SEU model performs strongly across these 4 energy justice criteria. What enables the SEU to achieve success in this metric is its malleable nature, which allows communities to transform the SEU model in whatever works best for them. So communities can take steps to ensure recognition, procedural, distributional, and restorative justice are fulfilled. Consequently, the SEU's ability to achieve energy justice is one of its strengths, and one makes it stand out, in my opinion. Many of the tenets of energy justice are inherent to the SEU model. And then to summarize our criteria altogether, our SEU model has the potential to make electricity consumption for communities more equitable and affordable. SEU services can provide electricity at a lower cost compared to utilities and can provide financial assistance that will help residents pay for cost-prohibitive solar and efficiency services that were unaffordable prior. If the SEU is constructed in a manner that encourages community accountability and more equitable access, it will fulfill the tenets of energy justice. Moreover, the model's distributed solar services will help communities advance our state's climate goals, but reliability is the weakest performing criteria, though it does perform in a fair manner, because, you know, there's a lot of variables that impact reliability with the SEU model. And to wrap my whole presentation, the SEU is compatible with current technology and the current technology and legal landscape. Municipal ownership enables community decision-making and accountability to constituents. This model offers a plan for immediately acting on climate, with a potential to reach up to 60% of sustainable generation goals at the community level. But significant study is needed at the community scale to identify specific needs, existing infrastructure, and interests for this model. Costs to ratepayers should not increase, however, that is our prediction. That is also Ann Arbor's prediction. And then the SEU must front all initial costs to sustainable development. That requires significant upfront funding, the 100% debt financing that we talked about, and then we assume that that's going to be repaid back through the ratepayer system, as I've explained. And yeah, that was the SEU. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Anita. Well, and I want to leave it there so that we have a few minutes for questions. I'll just put up this final chart, which is the compilation of all these together. And what you see is that the students undertook a really complex analysis, right? Like looking at multiple dimensions at 4, kind of 5, if you include both levels of munis, different solutions against these criteria. And you'll see strengths and weaknesses. The SEU comes out actually with the most strong, but all of them had at least one, if not 2, big benefits, and a lot of it's based on community. I just want to end with the one caveat that Mark started with, which is we did not start this looking at political feasibility, because you could start and end the analysis of each of these looking at political feasibility, particularly with the political power of investor-owned utilities right here. So we factored in governance, all these other things, but we were looking long-term, right? And we were looking analytically. And so it's not a measure of the sort of politics behind this, but different ones have different political implications. So I think we left at least a little bit of time for questions. I would love to open it up. Mark, I don't know if there's a format for that, or
So if you can take the slides there, that way you can see. So Charles Morris has got his hand up. So Charles, you get to go first to the first question.
Yeah, I just question, maybe this is for Nia, but the SEU model is that you just had, in terms of variability, you focus, they said, exclusively on just solar. However, if you had other technologies, renewable technologies, such as, you know, combined heat and power in some areas, maybe wind, when you have, you know, certain parts of the state where that might be even a smaller scale wind, and geothermal, might that strengthen, you know, if that was factored in, recalculate, make that variability a lot stronger.
Mm-hmm.
No, thank you, Charles, for that comment. Certainly, I think the reason why our SEU model focused on solar is because our model is very community-based. So for a small community of 10,000 people, I think the easiest path to renewable energy will be solar installation instead of, you know, unfortunately not the technical expert in my team, so you lucked out. You have the policy expert here. But to the best of my understanding is that in such a small scale where the SEU thrives, I think solar is the first answer, though of course as technology advances, for sure, those become available options.
I'm gonna throw a question in here too. Mike, I unfortunately have some background in emergency response planning, oddly enough, from being at the energy office. But I think if you look at the question of reliability, that in both the municipal model and the SEU, emergency response planning and management goes up dramatically, given the fact that whenever there's an outage, all the fire stations and police and everything else have to fire up natural gas fired generators locally, which it's your distributed generators pollute like crazy. DTE may be able to tell us that they have clean burning fuel, but certainly not the generator local operating locally at your fire station does not. So on those two areas, I think just emergency planning would probably raise the reliability issue beyond, it is fair, but I think it gets much more stable when you start looking at on-site generation and storage, as opposed to firing up a bunch of generators and diesel generators.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We didn't look specifically at emergency response, but it's embedded in those reliability variables, and I agree with that assessment, particularly for the SEUs and munis. I mean, it's kind of anytime you bring it down to the more local level, you're going to generally get that better emergency response, right? I mean,
Yes.
just in principle, in that way.
Good. Time for a few more questions. Anyone? Jay? Unmute, Jay. You gotta unmute.
Yep. I'm going to ride on your comments about emergency response. Currently Michigan goes and has an ice storm. DTE calls in hundreds, if not thousands, of trucks are rolled from neighboring states. Manpower, travel expenses, housing, food, etc., are all covered, and there are agreements with this. Does this plan in any way take into account the reciprocal of that, of providing mutual aid if, say, Indiana has a large outage? Are you planning on having the people that work the power system here being available to go and uproot themselves, roll 1,000 trucks, and go into Indiana? Because that mutual aid, those agreements between power companies helping one another out, is what keeps the nation running. And without that, you stand alone and you fail.
Interesting.
Interesting. I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, Zoe and Pratna and Ada, I don't think we looked at that at all. So don't really have an answer on that one.
No, at least for the individual municipalities, we didn't find that individual municipalities contributing to mutual aid was significant. And so that wasn't something that was included in any of our assessments. I think the answer may be different when you're looking at more scalable methods like our statewide power, but I can kick that over to Pratna.
Yeah, we looked at managerial expertise as a part of the governance structure, and we recommended that the manpower and managerial expertise be carried over from the investor-owned utilities when there is a statewide transition. So essentially, all of the tasks and jobs that were being carried out by employees of TTE would then be transferred to them being employees of the statewide publicly owned power entity. But we didn't specifically look at the interplay between state communications and emergency response situations. But that's a good point to consider for us.
Nikki, unmute. There you go.
Yeah, with the way Michigan works, municipalities have a lot of powers that counties and townships don't have. So how are we incorporating all of the non-municipal people within the county into these programs? A, and B, have you looked at the feasibility of the equivalent of a rural co-op? In Colorado, I belong to a rural co-op rather than to an investment owned or anything. It worked very well. And so I was wondering if you looked at anything along those lines also.
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is there are a number of rural co-ops operating in Michigan, typically in the north of the state that operate successfully with good reliability figures. Those co-op structures weren't a part of our analysis, but we did look into, especially when we looked at the widespread municipalization case. One of the largest challenges in Michigan is that without legal changes, it would be really difficult to do this on, for example, like a county-wide scale, if we looked at like a Wayne County public power structure. Because in the Michigan Constitution and the way municipalities are allowed to set up their utilities, they are only allowed to operate within the corporal limits of that municipality. So when you look at trying to like have a centrally owned power structure that operates across different city and township lines, that would be really challenging without existing legal challenges to the way municipal utilities are able to be set up. So it wasn't included in our analysis in part because of those legal limitations, but we do have some caveats about like recommending some of those changes in a like future research project or future advocacy effort.
Yeah.
So how are any of the suggestions climate justice if it doesn't include the rural poor areas of a county?
Well, so the municipal analysis doesn't because it has to be municipal. But when you think about the statewide public option, that
Right.
essentially is creating a co-op for the state,
Right.
right? That is what that option is. And that's what you have, like Nebraska essentially has that model. It's the one state that does. And so that is the option that covers all the others. That's why the municipal option did not look that great from a justice standpoint, because when you have multiple municipalities, what you do is you actually leave out those rural areas and saddle them with higher costs. So that's why the munis, it's an interesting analysis because it might look good for an individual city, but if you look at justice on the scale outside of that, it doesn't look as good. Other options look better on that. It's a really good point.
But Mike, a township could be an SEU. And if you dig deep into the Constitution, counties are actually defined as a state outpost. That's why they all have the same size. How far can I ride a horse in a day? That determines how big a county is. So if you have a SEU within a county like Ann Arbor, there's nothing to say that Ypsilanti can't join or other places can't join. And if there is a statewide municipal or co-op, as you described it, Mike, the state would be able to come in and basically plug those counties or state outposts in, and that's another path for how this could happen. But I think, if you look where the 42 municipals are, a lot of those are in places where they're bordering rural communities all over the place. And so having those municipals, they could do this tomorrow if they wanted to extend that. Tribes can do intertribal transfers among tribes. So we could move renewable energy from generated anywhere in Michigan that is on tribal land and send that any place in Michigan to any other tribe under existing law today. So there's a lot of options here to tackle this thing once we make the decision to move forward. John Freeman, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I did, and we were running late. But I guess my comment is, first of all, I just want to thank all the students and Mike for doing this. This is an amazing piece of work you all did. And I think when the report comes out in July, I think a lot of groups should read it and start some discussions about it. But at the same time, I can't help, because of my background, of separating politics from actually making something happen. And because we have some recent examples, the Maine case where I think it was voted down fairly decisively. And then, of course, there was a municipalization effort in Boulder, Colorado, which also failed. And I kind of view Boulder as similar to Ann Arbor in the sense that it's a highly educated college, fairly middle to middle high income community. And one of the things I think is fascinating about the sustainable energy utility is that if the city of Ann Arbor can actually work the kinks out, so to speak, then that can become a shining example for many other cities in the state to look at. Grand Rapids in particular, Traverse City may be another one, though they do have their muni. So in terms of actually thinking long term, you know, I just think the SEU is really a fascinating development because it does sidestep all the litigation issues and it sidesteps the money issue. And change is hard, even under the best of circumstances. And so if Missy and the city of Ann Arbor, and I heard Missy say just 2 days ago that the SUV is going to be on the ballot this November in Ann Arbor. And so what happens with that vote and the actual implementation of it, I think will bring out lots of practical lessons that we can all learn from, and we can then export this model throughout other cities in the state of Michigan. But again, I really think that what you've done is amazing, really helpful, because it takes a discussion which is abstract and makes it real by putting it on paper and giving it all the thought that you did. And so for that, I just want to thank you.
Well, thanks. And the thanks goes to the students who, by the way, put in extraordinary amounts of effort on this. This was a class that I think it was 3 credits that, and some of them were putting in basically full-time work on this. You've got 3 examples of it on this because it's so it's interesting, it's complex, it's real world, and all those different pieces to it. But so one, I just want to give thanks to the students who put in the work on this. And two, John, I totally agree. In my own, the thing about SEU too is that it can be a pathway to municipalization. It can be a proving ground for some of those that works pretty darn quickly as well. And so I think that is why it holds up pretty well on these criteria. If we had put political feasibility in there as a criteria, I also think SEU probably rises to the top on that as well. Just in my own, just a qualitative take on that.
If I can make one other semi-funny comment, maybe to wrap this up. Since your class focuses on problems, maybe a topic for a future class may be the political influence of investor-owned utilities in Michigan and how to undo that. So,
Yes.
So by the way, that is on the table for the next one that Andy Bucksbaum specifically is going to do, and potentially with voters, not politicians, and some of those folks who've done a good job of getting money out of politics. So as a little preview, spoiler, John, I don't know if you knew that already, but that's actually likely where it's headed.
Terrific.
Come back
Thank
and
you
do
so
a
much.
presentation on it when you do that. We'll definitely do that. When you publish a report coming up, let me know so we can showcase it again. And I know there'll be a summary document. I'd like to work with you about just getting a little article about it and links that we can give out under our newsletter as well. So, Mike, thank you so much as usual. I'm in awe of your work and the stuff that you've done and what you continue to do, and the graduate students. You guys give me hope. This is great. This is great. So thank you very much. Good night to everyone.